Carefully look into the concepts, understand them. Now this is where the capital receipt forms a very important factor. Now expenditure cannot be just written in one word and said that government wants to improve the railways. This is a very important topic for all of us to understand today. Expenditure is equal to expenses. It means government is getting some money because of taxation. Fiscal deficit. What is a fiscal deficit altogether? Good morning and welcome to the second session of Chapter 11, Government Budget and Economy. Let's have a quick look into the topics what we are going to see today. So the topics that we are going to cover is capital receipts, classification of expenditure, the capital expenditure itself, that's one of the very important topics, and we are also going to talk about FRBMA. That's a very important management act. That was a budget act that was brought in the year 2003. Then we are going to talk about balance, surplus and the deficit budget all about. Then we are going to talk about measurement of government deficit, fiscal deficit and the non-debt creating capital. So quite a lot of topics to be looked into it. All of them are very interesting and quite informative. All we just need to do is that carefully look into the concepts, understand them so that we can move with the flow. So going forward, let's try to understand the capital receipts altogether. Now, what is a capital receipt? The government also receives money by the way of loans or from the sale of its assets. Now, this is where the capital receipt forms a very important factor. Why? Now, the government will always try to get some money from the sale of assets or from the loan. So, government will also try to lend money. Government will sometimes try to sell its own assets, the non-performing assets, and get some money from it. So, the loans will have to be returned to the agencies from which they have borrowed. So, the government has to give back those loans. So let's say that today Government of India has borrowed money from IMF, from World Bank or from WHO or from any of those like Asian Development Bank. So they have to return back that money back to the institution or to the agency at a particular rate of interest. So that is where capital receipt forms a very important factor. So you have to give back the money. It is like borrowing from any other bank or from commercial institution altogether. They create a liability. So capital receipts are primarily liabilities creator. Now you are creating a liability, but then let's look at the positive side of the liability. By borrowing money from this leading institutions, you are able to create an asset. You are able to create some development for your nation. But then when it comes to the accounting standard, since you have borrowed money, that money will be returned back to that particular institution with some rate of interest. Sale of government assets like shares in public sector undertakings. Recently, if you would have seen that there has been a lot of disinvestment programs that has taken place from the government of India. Now, what is this disinvestment all about, sir? Now, when you look at public sectors like NTPC, ONGC, Bharat Petroleum, Indian Oil Corporation, GAIL, Gas Authority of India Limited, all these are all public sector undertakings. Sometimes the government feels that there are certain companies which are not able to compete, which are not able to perform according to the market standards, according to the global standards altogether. So what happens is that the companies start forming a liability to the government of India. So this is the chance, this is the situation where government decides that let us sell off those companies, either in the form of physical assets or in the form of shares to the public, and let's make some money out of it. So the sale of government assets like those shares or those physical forms leads to the forming of capital assets altogether. Now moving forward, classification of expenditure. Now expenditure cannot be just written in one word and said that yes, this is the expenditure that you can see. Classification of expenditure is highly mandatory because we need to understand what kind of expenses a government is making altogether. The first one is the revenue expenditure. Revenue expenditure is the expenditure incurred for the purposes other than creation of physical or financial assets of the central government. Now, for example, the government will try to make some expenditure out of the money that they have earned, not for the sake of buying an asset or an inventory altogether. They do this because they want to see people getting some benefit. So let's say that the government has earned some money today. The government has made some money today. So the government will go ahead and they would start making an income or a revenue out of it. So that is where this will become a very, very important factor altogether. Budget documents will classify the total expenditure into planned and non-planned expenditure. So that is also very important thing. You need to classify which are the ones that are planned, which are the ones that are non-planned in nature altogether. So that is a very, very important and a key concept. Why? Because you need to understand which are those things that are kept planned. The government has already planned in their mind. These are the expenses that we are going to make this year. These are the expenses which we are not going to make. So now you have something which is planned. When I say that, there is already a fixed budget in the mind. Non-planned are like emergencies, are like situations which the government would haven't experienced at any point of time. So when we talk about this word called as emergencies itself, the non-planned factor will come into picture. Planned ones are there where government is already done, let's say for sports and youth development, for women empowerment, for child education. These are all something which are already built in inside the budget altogether. Moving forward, capital expenditure. These are the expenditures of the government which result in creation of physical or financial assets or reduction in financial liabilities. Now, for example, government wants to improve the railways. Government wants to improve the metro. They want to increase the growth in terms of, let's say, some financial development or some infrastructural development, or it might be on services side. So what happens here is that the physical and financial assets that the government decides to invest altogether, that's where you would be seeing that there is a capital expenditure that is happening. It's a capex. Why? Because you need to infuse a huge amount of money from your own capital into the business, into the economy for the self-development. So automatically you will also see a word called as reduction in financial liabilities. Using this money, you can go ahead and you can borrow, you can settle out all the external loans, you can settle out all the external factors that you have borrowed. So in understanding the reduction of those financial liabilities itself, the capital expenditure forms a very important part altogether. So the capital expenditure, as I have told you, can also be a part of a planned or a non-planned exercise. So many times what the government tries to do is that they plan it out. What can be the best sectors there where we can invest? What are all the sectors that we can do for something else, or where we can keep those emergency funds so that during the time of any emergency or breakdown or any kind of situation, we can go ahead and take care of this. So that is where this capital expenditure forms a very important part of the economy. Now moving forward, Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. This is a very, very important topic for all of us to understand today. Why? Now, the medium-term fiscal policy statement, actually, if you start looking into this Budget Act itself, this was actually brought in by the government in order to make them more responsible, more accountable for every single activity that is being done by the government of India towards the budget, towards understanding the needs and wants of the people. Now, if you look into the fiscal policy itself, that states a 3-year rolling period, a target is set. Normally, when you do a budget, you just keep in your mind a 3-month target and you start rolling the budget, keeping in mind that this will start working according to that level, according to that philosophy altogether. After some time, what happens here is that you start examining, the government itself will start reviewing that policy, will start reviewing the entire concept, trying to understand whether the revenue expenditure can be financed through revenue receipts on a sustainable basis, which means the expenditures that have been happening by the government of India, are they being on a sustainable basis? Can we continue doing like this for years to come? Are we able to run the business? Are we able to run the economy without any further disruption altogether? If that be the case, if that be the situation, that be the scenario altogether, then we understand that the fiscal policy has been working very good for the situation altogether. But then, how productive the capital receipts are being, including the market borrowings, are being utilized. That's another factor for us. Why? Because when you look into a fiscal policy, we would have borrowed money. We would have taken money from different angles, from different perspectives altogether. So when all those money are taken in form of debt by the government of India, it becomes highly responsible for the government to understand the proper utilization of money without getting distracted or disturbed. So the government will try to enact a policy, will try to enact an act through which they will try to say that how effectively we are using those capital borrowings. Where are the sectors in which we are infusing the funds so that the growth happens on a regular level altogether. So that is why capital receipts and borrowings are a very, very important part when we try to talk about the capital expenditure altogether. So when government tries to borrow money from an Asian Development Bank or from a World Bank or from an IMF, there is a huge amount of responsibility, there's a huge amount of money fraction that goes inside. So it is the responsibility of the government to see that the budget does not get disturbed at any point of time, and they are able to effectively carry out every single project for which the money is borrowed, and they are able to deliver the projects on time. So for that purpose, the FRBMA Act, that is the Responsibility and the Budget Management Act of 2003, tries to set a guideline to all the institutions, to all the government agents, to all the technocrats and bureaucrats who are involved in the budget making, to say that how quick, how clear and how crisp they are in terms of making the budget so that the economy is making a progress step by step. Now, moving forward, balance, surplus and deficit, three forms of budget that we are going to look in today. Now let's look at the first one, balanced budget. Moment the word that comes itself, yes sir, it is balanced, which means to say that the government might spend an equal amount of money of the revenue that it collects. So that is a balanced budget. The amount of money that comes inside the hand of government goes out as expenditure. So I would say that capital, that is receipts, is equal to revenue. So which means expenditure is equal to expenses. It means the expenditure part is equal to whatever the money that you have collected. When capital is equal to revenue, which means to say that whatever money collected by the government is equally spent back in the market, we say that capital is equal to revenue, and that is the form we say it's a balanced budget. So there is not much of disruption here and there. Assets is equal to liability, so you would now say it as the word balanced budget altogether. Now in the second part, when the tax collection exceeds the expenditure, that means now your revenue is more than expenditure. That means it is a surplus budget. So you get more income when compared to liabilities, more income compared to expenditure, then you will call it as surplus. That means the country is able to collect more and more tax, so more income is coming into the situation here, and they are able to manage well above the expenditure. Expenditure is a small fraction, but income is a larger fraction altogether. Then we will call it as a surplus budget. Now, when we move towards the next part, when the expenditure is more than revenue, So suppose the tax collection is lesser, but the expenditure on government is very high, then we will call that as deficit budget altogether. So that is another factor. We don't want to see a deficit budget at any given point of time, because a deficit budget will not promote anything good for the country. The country has to throw huge amount of money back again, because extra expenditure will happen to the government. So a deficit is a kind of scenario when you look into the government sector, when the government is not able to make any good income, the tax system is very weak and the income flow becomes very weaker altogether. So that is why they try to see that they always try to move towards a balanced budget. In case when things are positive, they would definitely like to see a surplus budget altogether. Now moving forward, measurement of government deficit. How do you measure the deficit? How do you measure the shortcomings in the government altogether? So you have a revenue deficit, which refers to the factor that excess of government revenue expenditure over the receipt. You know that the government is making some money in terms of receipts. The government is getting some money because of taxation, because of sale, because of some kind of income that is coming into the government hand. But if the revenue expenditure, the money that is being collected in the form of tax, is going more higher, in the same that if the government is paying more salaries, the government is paying all that money that is collected in form of pension, in the form of some allowances. So what is happening here is that the revenue expenditure becomes higher than the revenue receipt. So whatever money you have collected might not be enough. What you would do in return is that you are trying to make more expenditure. If that be the case altogether, then what happens here is that we call it as a revenue deficit. The revenue comes down. It's in a deficit condition because your expenditure is higher when compared to the receipt. How do you calculate it? A very simple formula: expenditure minus receipt. So revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts is equal to your revenue deficit. That's a very simple formula you need to keep in your mind, so that whenever you are trying to understand the revenue factor, all this is the formula that comes to your top of your mind. Expenditure minus receipts will give you the deficit. Moving forward, fiscal deficit. What is a fiscal deficit altogether? Fiscal itself means expenditure. So the difference between government's total expenditure and total receipts excluding borrowing. So we are not going to include borrowing. That's the most interesting factor. You cannot borrow money and expense it out. That will be a very bad situation for the economy. So what we try to do here is that the government's outlay in terms of expenditure, that's what we are trying to talk here, the government's total expenditure and its total receipts, whatever is the total receipts, the income that we have got. We need to adjust between that. We need to see the difference. That's why we say the gross fiscal deficit is nothing but total expenditure minus revenue receipts plus the non-debt creating capital. That means we are not including the borrowings. We are not including the money that is coming out from abroad or from anywhere else. We are only trying to see that whatever money we have got, whatever money that we are expending for an infrastructure, for a project, that has to be done well within the income that we have made. Suppose we start borrowing money for our own expenses, we will be creating an overall debt again in the structure, which will lead to a problem. So what we tend to do, what we tend to understand here itself is that going with the gross fiscal deficit, the total expenditure, let's say the total expenditure is 1 lakh crores minus the receipts, whatever revenue receipts we have got, plus non-debt creating. Non-debt means which is not accumulating as a loan on the top of the economy. That's not a non-debt creating. That's just an amount that we have received from other factors. So when you use this formula, we will come to know what is the gap in fiscal. So fiscal deficit, the word deficit itself means shortcoming or something in short, equals to total expenditure minus revenue receipts plus non-debt creating capital. That is where we are trying to understand this gross deficit of the factors in economy. Now, non-debt creating capital. What is a non-debt creating capital? And non-debt creating capital receipts are those receipts which are not borrowing. So that's the key word that we need to take here. They are not the borrowings. Therefore, they do not give rise to debt. So that means these are not those external factors. So they will not create an external impact. They will not create a pressure on the government of India. So these are the non-capital, which means to say here, these are ones which are not borrowed from anywhere. No IMF, no World Bank, anywhere. These are things which we have got from the internal sales or from any other factors altogether. Examples are recovery of loans and sale from PSU. That's what I was trying to talk about. So when you recover the old loans, when you sell those non-performing companies, when you sell out on shares, when you sell out on those physical assets, you will be able to get some money. Using that money, you are trying to refinance yourself. You are trying to reuse of that entire amount to sort out your fiscal expenditure. So that is what we call it as the non-debt creating capital. So this is a very, very important form in economics. Why? Because if an economy tries to understand and tries to work without borrowing money from external factors, then automatically the economy can make a huge progress altogether. So that is why for a country like India, we are always trying to talk about self-reliance. We are always trying to talk about Atmanirbhar. That is very, very important. Unless and until we become self-reliant, unless and until we come to the situation where we are non-debt creating, we don't borrow money, we have the resources by ourselves, the fiscal expenditure cannot be met. And when the fiscal expenditure is not met, automatically debt will start mounting up, which will in turn return in going forward addition of taxes and other system. So it is the primary duty of our country to see that we stop the borrowings and we start financing by ourselves. With this factor, we come to the conclusion of this session. I hope and believe that this session was educative, informative, and interesting. In the next session, we will be seeing about the different factors of the budget, and we will be also trying to understand how the economy's importance comes from certain technical terms of the budget. Until then, a goodbye and good luck from my side. Please stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay educative always. Thank you once again.